Definitions. Etching. A metal plate, typically copper or zinc, is coated with a varnish-like substance known as the ground that is impervious to acid. In etching, a ground is an acid-resistant substance that is adhered to the metal plate through which an image is created. There are three general types of grounds that are used to produce three distinct image-making techniques. The artist creates an image by drawing through the ground with an etching needle, thus exposing unprotected lines of metal. The metal plate is then immersed in acid until the exposed lines are sufficiently bitten, producing grooves in the metal that will hold the ink. The ground is then removed and the plate is ready to be inked and printed. Hard ground, traditionally made with asphaltum painted onto the surface of the metal, dries hard and is used to create lines or marks on a plate using various tools that scratch through it. Soft ground is a variation composed of asphaltum and mutton tallow or beeswax. After this ground is applied to the plate, it stays waxy and doesn't harden. This enables the artist to achieve textures and loose, thick lines in an image. A piece of fabric or even a thumbprint can be pressed into this ground, and when lifted off, the ground adheres to the texture, thereby exposing the raw metal to be etched in the acid. Aquatint is a ground like the others, but it is not a solid coating on the plate. Aquatint is used for making tonal areas from light to dark and is composed of fine particles of rosin. A fine dusting of rosin covers the entire plate, after which the metal is heated, crystallizing the rosin so it adheres to the plate. The artist uses a paintbrush and an asphaltum mixture called stop out to protect specific areas from the acid. The acid bites around each tiny grain of rosin, creating a tooth in the plate to hold ink. The deeper the etch around the rosin, the more ink will be held there, and the darker the tonal area becomes.
I'm Denese Sanders, and I'm the director of Open Ground Studios in Seaside, California. I'm so delighted that the Museum of Monterey has decided to really celebrate printmaking in this community from early on to today. All of my work begins with drawing. It either starts with a rough sketch or a very complex sketch, and then I figure out what medium it wants to go to next that will be the most expressive way to get my idea across. So over here on the table I've got a work in progress. It's an artist book with ropes that are binding it together, and I'm not showing you the inside because it's not done, but the inside is where prints are going to live. I do wood cuts, I do painting on wood. When I moved to Chicago and got my degree at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, I started etching on steel plates, which was a whole new revelation because you can work large less expensively than you can on copper. Back in the early day when Armin Hansen was printing, he was printing on copper using very corrosive acids. For 400 years we use these kind of grounds. We have evolved over time as a people and as artists, and really have started to explore ways that we can keep doing this work without hurting ourselves and hurting our environment. Once the plate has a ground on it, whether it's a hard ground or a soft ground or aquatint, it needs to be etched. Once that etching starts to take place, that's when your image starts to come alive. So I've already put a large plate in our acid bath, but I want to give you just a little heads up about what acid is. It used to be that we etched copper with hydrochloric acid, and it would be in a bath like this, and every time the etching action took place, fumes would come into the air. Well, we are much more health conscious these days, and so most of printmaking is moving into a non-toxic fashion. So the ground I have on my plate is called Baldwin's Big Ground, and it's a non-toxic ink ground, which is amazing, and that's a hard ground. And we are using a ferric chloride for our acid, which is more of a corrosive than a fume-based acid. It's in a vertical tank, so all the particles drop and all of the fumes drop. So I am going to pull my plate out of the acid with my appropriate protective gear. And I let as much of the acid drip into the tank. I don't want this to go down the sink because, like I said, it's a corrosive. So what I do is very quickly move it over to a water tray, which is what this is. And once I do that, I'm able to put it back in the sink and I can rinse it off further, so that then I can take it back into the other room and work on it more, or I can take the ground off and print it next. Before this goes down the sink, I use a pH neutral test strip to make sure that it's neutralized. I first put more water in it, and then I put baking soda or soda ash to help neutralize it. So we try to keep as sustainable and as ecologically friendly as we can here at Open Ground Studios. So this is a photo exposure unit, and we use this unit to expose photopolymer plates or copper plates that have a photosensitive emulsion on top. And basically it allows us to use whatever photographic images that we have, whether it's a drawing that we want to use digitally, like this is, or even if it's just a straight up photograph. We place it on top of our photosensitive plate. There's a light that exposes that plate, and it basically etches it without acid. Once that's done, we can print it intaglio just like we would a regular copper etching, but it gives us a huge realm of possibility in terms of image making and intaglio printmaking. My first love with printmaking was etching when I took it in college in Madison, Wisconsin with Warrington Colescott, and ever since then I fell in love with it. I went to Paris, France to study at Atelier 17, where Stanley Hayter was still alive, and it was the first studio in the world to really create color inside the etching process. And if you look at the old masters, you'll notice that almost all of them are either black and white or brown and white. They often used cream-colored paper to get that extra warmth. With Atelier 17 and their collaboration, they not only brought color printing into the intaglio etching process, they also brought the idea of collaborative studios to the United States. Hayter moved his studio to New York City in the 1940s, and from that point forward, printmaking in the United States changed, etching in particular, and what we did with the prints. And so I'm demonstrating today not color viscosity, which is what they're known for, but I like using this method to enhance my prints and to enhance the color capacity of prints. And I learned how to work with the inks there in a way that I've never been taught elsewhere, so I find this is to be quite a neat process, and I thought you might like to see it. So I have my colored inks here. They're transparent in nature. I started with transparent base, and I'm using this large roller. You have to have a roller as large as your plate, a little bit larger than your plate in order for this to work. So I'm going to be creating a transparent relief roll to go over the top of one of a two-plate print. The plates that I'm using are both intaglio plates, but they aren't copper and they aren't zinc, and they weren't etched. Again, with contemporary printmaking, we've started to use a lot of different media for the process to just basically serve the purpose that needs to be served. So the two plates that I'm printing today are a colograph plate, which is to my right. Colograph is one of my favorite things to use because of its flexibility and its capacity for texture. My plates are made out of mat board, which means that I can cut them any shape. I can apply whatever textures or gel mediums I want on them to create a certain atmosphere. All right, so now I come over to my already inked up plate, and I set it on the glass first. And I'm not going to press very hard on this because I want it to hit mostly just the top spaces. So it's a two-plate print, and I'm going to print this first. This is a photopolymer plate that I showed you in the acid room. All right. Here we go. My press is a Dickerson combination electric press, which is unusual compared to all the other presses we've seen. When I press this button, it's going to turn the motor on, and I've already adjusted the pressure here. I have to keep my paper engaged under the roller. There are systems to do this by yourself, but you'll note with Armin Hansen's press at the museum, the size of the bed will limit the size of the plate you can use. And that is, again, what's interesting about etching in today's world. The bigger the plate is, the bigger everything has to be. The bigger the acid tray has to be, the bigger the press bed, the bigger the paper, the bigger the water tray. And so we try to accommodate that kind of thing at Open Ground so that we can really move into a lot of experimental and unique ways of working without limitation. So that's a 2-plate print using 2 different processes.
My name is Dora Rosenbaum. I first came to printmaking and fell in love with etching as my medium of choice back in college. Since then, right after college, I moved to Italy and I worked at a printmaking school in Venice for a year. I then went on and I got my master's in printmaking in Rome at the Accademia di Belle Arti there. I then came back to the US to do my graduate studies at Indiana University, where I focused mostly on etching, but I did expand a lot of what I work on. I do silkscreen and lithography and photo-based processes as well. So that's really when I began thinking kind of in these bigger terms, thinking I love etching, but I want to do more. The show that we put together for the Museum Monterey focuses on etchers of the past on the peninsula, being very traditional, black and white, and stepping through the ages up until what people are working on today, how printmaking has evolved, has changed, has grown, but is still very deeply rooted in tradition. What I try to do as an artist is take printmaking, etching in particular with this body of work, and push it far, push it beyond its boundary, or just right till its boundary. So we're no longer working with editions of prints. We're working with individual prints that I often cut out on very thin paper. You can see the ink through the back, so there are now 2-sided prints. And there's been a whole evolution in printmaking, working bigger and bigger and bigger, and then using these prints to create installation work. The term that has been coined is printstallation. You either love that term or you hate it, but it's out there and it's stuck. So using different print media to create large-scale, room-size, all-inclusive atmospheres for the audience, for people to walk into and to enjoy, or creating sculptural pieces. One of my pieces in the show is a sculptural piece. It is made out of prints. They are etchings, but they are not on a wall. They are not framed. My work uses different kinds of the same object. The idea of the multiple is not quite as literal, but it's still there. So this over here is a work in progress. I'm trying stitching right into the paper. Again, kind of working with methods of display, so not on the wall. These eventually will be on shelves. The lighting is very important. I've been incorporating scent into my work as well. So really expanding, and using each medium for what it can do for you. It's a very conscious decision. It's a very purposeful decision. It greatly affects how the work is both created and how the work is understood. What I am going to demonstrate first here is how to do a soft ground print, which is one of the intaglio techniques. It is similar to what Justin demonstrated, but the ground that I have put on this plate remains soft. So it comes in this ball ground here, and it's a mixture of asphaltum and beeswax, and it's an acid-resistant coat, and it goes on with this leather roller. You need a very good roller. It has to be very smooth and even for this process to work correctly. What soft ground lets you do is get texture. While a hard ground etching is like a line drawing, a soft ground allows for textures, it allows for impressions to be made onto the plate and then etched. So that's what I use in my work, which is why I wanted to show you how it's done. So I have my plate prepared. I'm going to set these aside. And I've just chosen 3 different lace textures to show you, things that will transfer pretty well. So what I do is lightly lay it on the surface. You want to be very careful not to touch the surface at all with your fingers. Anything that touches the surface will then be etched. So we'll lay a couple of these on here just to have different examples. What you can do, and the third one. You then cover this all with a piece of wax paper. And then you want to create some cushioning so that you can get all of the pressure into the different areas of the texture. So what I use are about 10 or 15 sheets of newsprint. lay that right on the top. We're creating a kind of a sandwich here. Put another larger piece just to protect the felts. We don't want to get anything on these felts. Carefully bring down just one felt. It's called the pusher felt. And the pressure is very light. I'm barely feeling the plate go under the pressure. There it is, going through, and it's come through the other side. So now we'll slowly peel them away. You have to remove all of the layers that we put down. You can see part of the impression on that wax paper as well. And then here, as we remove these, if you look closely onto the plate, you can see that it has picked up all of the ground where the texture has made contact with the plate. So it's best seen against the light. And this is a way you can get a lot of detail in there. All of the little hearts came out wherever this ground has been lifted off by the pressure. Now that we're going to go put it in the acid, it will eat away at it, creating grooves, which the ink will then hold onto, and we'll be able to print that image. This is a soft ground plate. It's one of the pieces that I'm working on right now. And I'm going to just show you quickly how I go about printing it on a very thin Japanese paper. So the process is a little bit different than if you're printing on the thick cotton rag papers that are normally used for printmaking. What we have to do first is we take this card, and on this plate, the acid has eaten away this whole texture. So when I touch it, I can feel all the little grooves. And what I'm doing here is pushing the ink into all of those little holes that the acid created. I'm not going to ink the whole plate. This is where we get away a little bit from traditional printmaking into more the work that I do, in which, you know, the print is a step in the process. I then take the image and I work with the paper. I cut it out, I sew into it, I make it more three-dimensional, I make it come off the wall. So what I really need is just my image. I don't need the whole plate to print. So I've put ink just where I care about it. Now we're going to take this tarlatan, which is nice and soft, and we're going to carefully start removing the ink just from the surface of the plate. So the idea here is that the ink remains only in the grooves. Another word for etching is intaglio, which is an Italian word that literally means in the cut. So the ink is being held in all of the grooves as opposed to on the surface. I chose a soft ground etching for this because I literally had to slide the underwear under the press. So it went through this pressure to create the plate like I showed before, which made these objects that are usually containers for the body, it flattened them out and it made them impossible to be containers. So it changes what the object is. It talks about identity and consumerism and how our clothing, even, you know, down to the most intimate pieces of clothing, are somewhat decided by culture, by our society, and how everything is kind of laden with meaning. Now that this plate is wiped clean, you can see how all of the ink is off of the surface and it's just being held. I'm gonna carefully put it on the press here. Take off these gloves, because from now on everything has to be clean. And we're going to go over and prepare our paper. So now we're ready to print this plate. Like I mentioned, we're going to print it on this very thin mulberry paper is what it's called. I've dampened it slightly so it's nice and soft. What we'll do is carefully lay it over the image, careful not to move it too much after it's made contact with the ink. Then we're going to take this thicker paper that's also moistened, and it's going to just serve as a backing paper. Lay it right over just where the image is. Piece of newsprint. We don't want to get any ink on these felts or they become useless. And we're going to carefully bring down the 3 felts. You print with 3 different felts on there, not like the transfer where we use just one. And now the pressure is a lot heavier. You can see it's harder to push through. And we're through to the other side. So now we'll come over here and we'll see what we got. This is always a wonderful moment in printmaking. You're never really quite sure what you're going to get, so hopefully it'll be a good example. Peel away all of the layers, and out comes our print. So now this has to dry. And usually what I do to have it dry is I just tack it up on the wall and let all the water evaporate, and it'll be nice and taut and flat when it's done.